Chapter 14. Nils reckoned the time had come for the wild geese to go south, for the weather was beginning to break in the mountain valley. Rain, storms, and thick mists alternated one after the other without ceasing, and when it cleared it was at once freezing and cold. During the summer he had lived off berries and wild mushrooms, but now the berries had frozen and the mushrooms rotted, so he was finally forced to eat raw fish, which he did not like at all. The days grew much shorter, and it was rather boring with early evenings and late mornings for someone unable to sleep as long as the sun was out of the sky. But it wasn't just because of the dark and cold, and that food was short, that he longed to get away from Lapland. He was longing to be back home with Martin the gander, and to become human again. One morning the ground was white as far as he could see. The snow did melt later in the day, and then Ch14 gave the signal for departure, for the wings of the young geese had grown out now, and they could leave. 31 geese flew south in an orderly skein, feathers fluttering and wings whipping the air with such a whistling that you could hardly hear your own voice. Ch14 from Kebnujensky flew in the lead, followed by Yiksi, Kakski, Kolme, and Nelja in one line, and Visi, Kusi, Dunfin, and Martin, with Nils on his back, in the other. Behind them, the 22 young geese. The poor young geese had never made a long trip before, so found it hard to keep up. "Ch14, Ch14, Ch14, they lamented. "Our wings are tired out." "The longer you hold out, the better it gets," said Ch14, flying on as before. She must have been right, for after the young geese had flown for an hour or two, they no longer complained of tiredness. But they were used to eating all day, and they started longing for some food. "Ch14, we're so hungry." "Wild geese have to learn to eat air and drink wind," replied the leader goose. So they learned to live off air, for after they had been flying for a while, they stopped complaining about being hungry. The old geese called out the names of all the mountain peaks so that the young ones would learn them. Oh, these are hard words. Porsocholo, Skarjetkokjoko, Sulitlama. "Ch14, we haven't room for all those names in our heads," the young geese complained. "The more that gets into a head, the more room there'll be in there," replied Ch14. And she went on calling out those amazing names. The boy was pleased when he saw the first pine forest, the first gray mountain farm, the first goat, the first cat, and he waved his cap and cheered. The bears at Tanfordson growled to their cubs. "Look at that lot, so scared of a bit of cold, they daren't stay home in the winter." But the old wild geese had an answer for them. "Look at that lot, preferring to go to sleep the whole winter than go to the trouble of going south." They kept meeting migrating birds, flying in much larger flocks than in the spring. "Where are you off to, wild geese?" they asked. "Overseas, just like you," cried the geese. Laps and reindeer were also moving down from the mountains. Nils saw a herd trekking down with a Lap in the lead, then the great bulls ahead of the others. After them, the pack reindeer with loads on their backs, and last of all, 10 or so Laps behind. The wild geese cried out, "Thanks for the summer," and the reindeer replied, "Have a good journey and welcome back." Hardly had the wild geese called out that they were now flying into Jämtland when the mists came rolling in and hid their view. So the boys saw nothing of the journey, and in the evening the geese came down on a green hill where everything was soaking wet, drops hanging from every blade of grass. So as soon as Nils moved, he was given a shower. He could just see a house so high it vanished into the mist, and he realized it must be an outlook tower. No doubt he could lie in the dry up there, so he asked Martin to fly him up and then fetch him again in the next morning. But when he woke, the geese had gone, and no one answered from the ground. The boy was quite desperate. Once again he was separated from Martin, and all kinds of things might happen to the gander on the journey. Suddenly, Bhakti was standing beside him. Nils never thought he would ever be so pleased to see the raven again. "Aka sends her regards," said the raven. "She saw a hunter roaming about on the mountain, and so didn't dare stay, but I will take you to your friends." High above the mists, Bhakti flew in brilliant sunlight. The wild geese nowhere to be seen, but that didn't worry the raven. "I'll find them all right," he said. When the mists lifted, he came down on a stubble field by an old farm, and the boy was able to search out a few grains for breakfast. After that, they flew to a tree on the top of a ridge and sat on a branch each. "I'm sure you don't know what kind of mound this is," said Bhakti. "It's a burial mound, and it was made for the first man to settle in Hardjedelen." Tell me about him, please," said Nils, munching on a grain of corn. "I don't know much," said Bhakti, "but he was a Norwegian called Hardjluf. He quarreled with the Norwegian king and so had to flee the country. He went to the Swedish king in Uppsala and was taken into his service. But then he wanted to marry the king's sister, and when the king objected, Hardjluf fled with her, which meant he could live neither in Norway nor in Sweden, and he didn't want to go abroad. There must be another way out, he thought. So he took his wife and all his people into the great desolate forests north of Dalarna. There he cleared land and built a house, and so became the first settler in this part of the country." The raven fell silent and suddenly looked thoughtful. "As we are alone together," he said in the end, "I will ask you something. Do you really know what conditions the gnome made for you to become human again?" "I've heard nothing, except I must bring the white gander back safe and sound again," replied the boy in surprise. "I thought as much," said Bhakti. "The last time we met, you spoke of how unpleasant it was to betray a friend, so you ought to know all of the conditions. Aka would perhaps prefer to help you rather than Martin the gander, but I think you will be grateful if you knew what the gnome said. Well, he said you will become human if you take the gander home so that your mother can slaughter him." The boy leapt up and almost fell to the ground. "You've just thought up that nasty idea," he cried. "Ask Aka," said the raven. "Look, there's the flock flying by, but don't forget, there's always a way out of difficulties as long as you can find it. It'll be fun to see whether you succeed." The boy sat sullenly on the gander's back, his head hanging, not bothering to look around as they flew over Dalarna. "I'll have to travel with the geese all my life," he thought, "so I'll be seeing more than enough of this country." And he was no happier when the wild geese called out that they were now in Varmland, and that the great river below was called the River Clare. "I've already seen so many rivers and forests, that's enough," he muttered. But before the wild geese had reached the long lake Frykten, darkness had begun to fall. The moon came up, brilliant and round, and they flew down and settled on a wooded hill. The boy raced off to find something to eat, and came to a road where a birch avenue opposite led up to a small manor farm. The house was surrounded by red rows of cottages, and at the back was a leafy garden. Nils slipped inside and found so many delicious berries he was quite dazed. Red currants, gooseberries, raspberries, and just imagine a great big red apple lying there on the path. He sat down beside it and cut off little slices with his knife. Being a gnome would be all right, as long as there was always this kind of food to eat, he thought. Perhaps I should stay here. I don't know how to explain to Martin why I can't go home. Perhaps it'd be better if I kept away from him. At that moment, a horned owl flew down on the path. "Nice to see a living creature," said the boy. "Can you tell me what this place is called, Mr. Horned Owl?" "This farm is called Marbacka, and you look like a nice tasty morsel," hissed the owl, fastening his claws into Nils's shoulder and pecking at his eyes. Nils realized his life was in danger and yelled for help as loudly as he could. Then he suddenly heard someone limping behind him, and the owl let go and flew up into the nearest tree. An old lady was standing there, shaking her stick at it. "Thank you for your help," cried Nils. The lady looked rather surprised, so he went on. "I'm a human just like you, but I've been turned into a gnome." "That is the most amazing thing I've ever heard," said the lady. "How did you get into such a terrible mess?" The boy told her everything that had happened, and saw that she grew more and more astonished, amazed, and pleased. "What incredible good fortune I should come across you, who have ridden on the back of a goose all through the country. I was born here at Marbacka, and I like writing stories and sagas most of all. Then I thought it would be fun to tell a story about Sweden for all the school children, and a book suitable for schools has to be instructive and absolutely true. It turned out to be so difficult I was just about to give up, but I can write just what you have told me into the book. You really have been a help."